Labour's results in these local elections are fine, and the party made important gains in London. Across the rest of England, there remain causes for concern. Outside London, the party has stood largely still, and despite being in the midst of the greatest fall in living standards since the 1950s and are having a prime minister almost universally believed to be a liar, there are few signs that Keir Starmer is in a position to win back the so-called Red Wall, which he believes to be so key to winning that next general election. And it's in this context that Starmer's allies have been out on television and radio trotting out excuses. This is Labour's National Campaign Coordinator, Shabana Mahmood, talking to Kay Burley.
Yeah, but you're up against a Prime Minister who's a known liar who breaks the law. You should be doing better.
Well, look, we've gone into these elections already holding more than 50% of the seats that were being contested. So I think it's important to remember the 2018 local election cycle, because that's the last time these seats were fought in England. And we already hold more than 50% of these seats. So from that historic high, the headroom for very significant gains is obviously more severely limited. However, we have still made gains.
Did you hear that? The reason gains were modest in these elections is that the seats being contested were last fought in 2018, a year which was for Labour a historic high. Of course, you'll probably also remember Labour's leader for those elections was one Jeremy Corbyn, which is why it was surprising that while Shabana Mahmood was making that argument on Sky, Laura Kuenssberg said this on the BBC.
One Shadow Cabinet Minister said to me this morning, basically they still are suffering from long Corbyn. A bit like long COVID. Now, you may not like that metaphor, but it's that sense that the party was so broken, in some people's view, that the recovery under Keir Starmer was always just going to take such a long time. Of course, his internal critics would say he may be competent, he's done some of the right things, but whether he'll ever have the dazzle to make the kind of impression and the kind of big strides forward to get them back to number 10 is still an open question.
That's right. Labour's gains look modest because they're being compared to a historically high vote share achieved by Jeremy Corbyn. And at the same time, Labour gains are modest because voters still haven't forgotten the damage done by Jeremy Corbyn. Quite difficult to hold both of those positions in one's head at the same time, but the shadow cabinet are managing it. Aaron, I want your comment on this sort of Schrodinger's Corbyn. We can't say these results were good because they were so good under Jeremy Corbyn, but also we didn't do as well as we would have done because people hate Jeremy Corbyn so much. Make it make sense for me.
Well, this was from Laura Kuenssberg, typical Laura Kuenssberg journalism. This person said X, so I'll say it. Okay, well, this person could say that, you're a sex offender. I mean, are you going to repeat it? Is that a sensible thing to do? No, of course it's not. It's a stupid thing to say. Is there any sort of evidence backing it up? Well, seemingly not, given that in last year's local elections, Labour did far worse with Keir Starmer than anybody anticipated. That was clearly not because of Jeremy Corbyn. They lost Hartlepool in a by-election, a seat that they won twice with Jeremy Corbyn. So patently stupid thing to say. I think only Laura Kuenssberg and the pundits in London would say it. And I think it does a complete disservice to voters who have a range of issues which they care about. And as I said at the top of the show, Michael, London mainstream media hates local elections precisely because it doesn't allow them to present themselves as the ones with the speed dial to the powerful. It means that the politicians who they have access to aren't the center of the story, and that upsets them. So they invariably try and make local political exercises, whether that's local elections or it could be elections in Scotland, Wales, etc. They invariably try and make that about what's going on in Westminster. They hate the idea of there being any other driving force in politics than the 650 people that sit down in Westminster and that talk to them in their gentlemen's clubs and in their bars in Soho and the TV studios. So that's the first thing. And I think when you're in that sort of environment and you're Laura Kuenssberg and, if somebody says something to you on WhatsApp and they're a Labour backbencher or Peter Mandelson, you believe them because of who they are. Well, A, that's bad journalism. B, it tells us nothing about the reality of actually what's happening in local elections, which I think is so fascinating. When you look at the various parties, Lutfer Rahman in Tower Hamlets, the Greens, the Lib Dems, the Tories winning in some places and losing, in terrifyingly bad ways in other places. I think it's so much more complex and interesting. I think people like Laura Kuenssberg, and I saw Mark Urban as well from BBC Newsnight tweet the same thing about Long Corbyn. I think that they're showing themselves to be incurious, stupid commentators, and I think they're doing a disservice to their profession. Because the point of journalists is not to receive a WhatsApp message from a Labour backbencher. It's to go out there and to find out what's driving people and why they're voting. So yes, it's easy. Yes, it's convenient. And yes, the lobby loves talking about it. But Long Corbyn has zero to do with what we've seen over the last 24 hours.
And you focus on the media element there, I think, which is very, very understandable, very good points. But it also raises a lot of questions about the Labour Party, right, in the shadow cabinet, because you're in a situation where the Conservative Party, everyone thinks their leader is a liar. We're going into a situation where there is going to be the biggest drop in living standards since records began, so at least since the 1950s. And Labour frontbenchers, and even Keir Starmer, actually, the thing they are most keen to say is, wasn't that 2019 general election very bad? They're still obsessed with talking about Jeremy Corbyn. They're still obsessed with talking about the Labour Party. It's like, how about talk about the guy who you're actually supposed to be trying to beat in the next general election, instead of talking about the guy who who is no longer Labour leader and you actually kicked out of the party? Like, what is this obsession with talking about Jeremy Corbyn? I saw a tweet today, which I thought was very insightful, which say what you want about Jeremy Corbyn. He never blamed Ed Miliband for everything that went on. It wasn't the case that 2 years into Corbyn's leadership in 2017, if there were some bad council elections, he would go on TV and all his shadow cabinet would go on TV and say, well, I think it's probably Ed Miliband's fault. But we're now at least 2 years into Starmer's leadership, and you've still got him trotting out and saying, the issue here is really Corbyn. You've got his shadow cabinet people going out and saying, we didn't do very well because these seats were won by Corbyn 4 years ago, and also we didn't do very well this time because people can't forget about Corbyn. It just seems like, get over yourselves. Like, look at the people you're supposed to be trying to beat and maybe think about the future instead of the past. Like, it does strike me as just being not only desperate, but also quite pathetic.
I think that's entirely right, Michael. And I think, I mentioned the media, but I think talking about Jeremy Corbyn, whether that's Jenny Chapman, who's like a Keir Starmer outrider, or whether that's just Labour MPs or Labour figures, Peter Mandelson briefing it or whatever, it shows they're not serious about actually winning. Nobody's talking or thinking about Jeremy Corbyn. Nobody, except people like Laura Kuenssberg. But in the real world, nobody's thinking about that. People are thinking about, wow, you had the Centre for Economics and Business Research a month ago. Their estimate was that we would see the average person lose around £1,000 worth of purchasing power this year because of inflation and stagnant wages, i.e. wages don't keep up with rising prices. The OBR, with the March spring statement, end of March, which is 6 weeks ago, not that long ago, was basically predicting around £500 worth of purchasing power lost. So at the same time, the CBR was saying it'd be about £1,000. Now, yesterday, the Bank of England basically tacitly said that it's going to be closer to £1,000 than £500. That £500 figure, by the way, is the one where people were saying this is going to be, the worst, the biggest hit to real incomes in 56 years or whatever it was, right? Well, actually, it looks like it may be twice as bad as that. That's what people are thinking about Laura Kuenssberg. They're not thinking about, have Labour decisively dealt with the Corbyn legacy? Yeah, okay. Parts of the electorate, maybe like 1 in 50 people might be thinking about that, and most of them aren't Labour voters anyway. I think it's just they're hobbyists, Michael. They view politics as some sort of interesting little hobby. And another thing that really fascinates me, but also sickens me, is they say, well, at this point in the electoral cycle, this should be this and this and this and this. Well, in the local elections in 2017, Labour did terribly, and then they did, significantly better in the general election in 2017 in May, where they saw, the biggest increase in the share of the vote since 1945. The Tories got smashed in the 2019 local elections, and they won a massive majority that December. Like, this isn't your little hobby where you say, well, we know at this point in the electoral cycle. No, we don't. Actually, all the evidence indicates the complete opposite. And what data are you pulling on? Are you pulling on just Britain? Is it globally? Because I can tell you, in the United States, presidents tend to lose the midterms when it comes to elections for Congress. Nobody says, well, at this point in the electoral cycle, they just kind of take it as writ that actually the incumbent doesn't do very well after 2 years. So they just have these regurgitated platitudes and cliches which they live on. Meanwhile, tens of millions of people aren't really given the benefit of a healthy, informed public debate. Worst of all, Michael, at the centre of this is a public service broadcaster called the BBC. The debate, the informed debate isn't going to come from the papers. You would at least hope it comes from the British Broadcasting Corporation. People like Laura Kuenssberg, Mark Urban, they're not part of the solution. They're part of the problem. So it's actively misinforming the electorate when you start talking about these absurd media talking points rather than what's actually driving them, which we know what they are: cost of living, inflation, and a lack of trust in party politics generally, which I think is going to hurt all the major parties, not just the Tories. We'll see how that unfolds.